May I begin in typical Irish fashion with an apology for the weather. The weather, of course, obsessed W.H. Auden when he dedicated his poem *Stark bewölkt* to Stella Mussolini. He was complaining about the Austrian weather, as we have every right to do today. May I secondly apologize for not addressing you in German, but believe me, you do not want to hear me speaking in German. Stella once said to me when I was staying with her, she had this marvelous maid called Erika, and Erika used to collect me at the station at 𝑻𝒉𝒆 and drive me up to Friedau in her car. And Stella said to me once, she said, "Michael, you are not to speak to Erika in German. You mustn't even try to speak to her in German." And I said, "Why, my dear?" And she said, "Well, it's quite simple. Your German is so appalling, it's worse than W.H. Auden's, but worse than that, you speak with the most horrible Viennese dialect. I don't know where you're learning it." And she said, "At least, thank God, you don't speak Schönbrunner Deutsch." So Stella was a woman of infinite intelligence and infinite humor. They were the two qualities that greatly appealed to me about her. We are here today for two reasons: to commemorate and to celebrate. We commemorate the man whose voice you have just heard. We commemorate the fact that that recording was made perhaps 2 hours before he died in the Hotel Alten Burgerhof in 𝑉𝒆 as my old friend Richard Bassett would say, a mere biscuit's throw from this building. Rather curiously, he asked for the first time to be driven home in what he called a nice car. Auden had no interest in cars whatsoever. He didn't know the difference between a Bentley and a beaten-up Morris Minor. He himself drove an old Volkswagen around Kirchstetten. He was a terror on the roads. He frightened everybody. But he asked to be driven home in a nice car. And years later, I asked Stella about that, and she said to me, "Well, all I know about Auden and cars is this. When he was in New York, his Volkswagen was stolen from outside his house in Kirchstetten, and it was used in a bank robbery. And while the police were chasing the robbers, they fired several shots at Auden's car, and the bullet holes were there to prove it." And when Stella invited him to lunch with her mother-in-law at Friedau, the first thing Auden said to her is, "Stella, my dear, you must come down and see my bullet holes. They're marvelous." So he dragged poor Stella all the way down those stairs at Friedau to see the bullet holes in his car. I want to dwell now on the notion of that is commemorating, part one. Part two is celebrating. We celebrate today an intellectual connection between two people, and when one talks about intellectual caliber, one is talking about the highest level of intellectual caliber on both sides. Stella had written one book by the time she met Auden, Vienna in the Age of Metternich, which is a wonderful romp through that 33 years of masterly diplomacy by Metternich. And she knew her history, she knew her Austrian history very, very well. She would later write a book called Austria, People and Landscape, which really showed her profound knowledge of this country and its history. And Auden wrote the foreword to that book. The thing I want to say about the relationship is it was a relationship of equals. It has never really been taken seriously enough, in my view, which is the reason I wrote this book, because I wanted to draw out the intellectual caliber of Stella and to show just how much Auden depended on him, depended on her for things like the obvious thing, the correction of his German. She would even be asked opinions of particular poems by him, which goes to show that he respected her intellect profoundly and took her quite seriously. At the moment on the www, you will find a marvelous website devoted to Stella and Auden. It's based on the generous gift of Marco Mussolini of his mother's papers to the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and it includes letters and journals and many other interesting items. It's been put together by Dr. Sandra Meyer and her team, and they've done the most incredible job, and my hope is that this book and that website will run together in tandem, side by side, supporting each other as the years pass. Austria has been very kind to Auden. No other country in the world has been kinder. My old friend Ricardo Denzer, 10 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of his death, where I had the honor of speaking at his graveside, produced the most extraordinary exhibition because she, as an art historian, did something quite unusual. She looked at the poet through an artist's eye. She left behind a considerable monument in the exhibition itself, but her greatest monument and achievement is the book, Objects Turned into Silence, on which she drew from a whole international range of scholars and left really what I call an indelible mark on Auden's scholarship as it stands. We also have Kirchstädtner Gedichte, brilliantly translated by Johannes Wolfgang Paul at the behest of a man called Peter Müller. I move on to Peter Müller now because it was Peter Müller who introduced me to Stella Mussolini 40 years ago. Peter Müller was an exceptional man. He was the Pressereferat of the Bundesdenkmalamt. And in that role, he had an access all areas pass to national monuments. But he did more than that. He founded the International Auden Society with his friend Karl-Heinz Roschitz, and he invited me to Vienna. And on my first night staying with him, he took out a wine decanter, a wine flagon that belonged to Maria Theresia. And he took out 2 glasses that belonged to this suite of drinking accoutrements that belonged to Maria Theresa. And he said, let's fill this decanter up with some good white wine, and let's drink a toast to the idea that we will have in Vienna the greatest literary exhibition in the history of literary exhibitions. I, of course, thought he was joking. But lo and behold, a week later, he had raised the money here in Austria. Little help from the British Council, but not so much. Most of the money came from the Austrian government. And we put on an exhibition that is still remembered and was described in the London Times at the time, in 1984, as one of the greatest literary exhibitions seen in Europe for many years. Now, Müller, let me describe him for you. He came from a humble background in Neulengbach, and when he went abroad to international conferences representing Austria, and somebody in the distinguished gathering would ask him where he is from, he never said, I'm from Austria. He said, I'm from Neulengbach, which is, as you know, a tiny village of 5,000 to 7,000 people near Friedau. And so he decided, when I was staying with him, that he would bring me down to meet Stella. I was terribly nervous. I was 22. Meeting this woman, I'd never met W.H. Auden. I was 11 when he died. I was still at school. And so I was about to meet the first person in the world who ever knew and met and was trusted by W.H. Auden. If that wasn't bad enough, over breakfast, he told me, we'll drive down to meet Stella, but on the way, we must stop at the Military History Museum, where I must inspect the Archduke's uniform. And I said, which Archduke? And he said, well, Sarajevo, there's only one Archduke, Franz Ferdinand. So we drove to the Military History Museum. All these Beamterei were gathered gloriously around this glass case. Flunkies lifted the glass, and there was the uniform of the assassinated Duke. Suddenly the room emptied. I was left alone with Muller, and he said to me, go on, touch it, touch all that terrible history. I'm happy to say I didn't, because I'm terribly superstitious, but it was an extraordinary moment for me, and this, as I was about to meet Stella Mussolini, but it gets better. We got into the car, and he then tells me, oh, by the way, Stella's father-in-law, the Baron Alexander Sándor von Mussolini de Gomirce, to give him his full handle, was the man who helped write the ultimatum to Serbia. So if I was nervous to begin with, I was now a nervous wreck at this stage. So I didn't know what lay ahead. So I had no idea what lay ahead. So we arrived in the great front entrance of Friedau. I saw before me this marvelous Baroque-style Schloss. And as my eyes widened, Muller said, no, forget about that. We can't go in there. The Russians destroyed it during their advance on Vienna. In fact, they used the great library to mend their boots. We turned right into this charming courtyard, which reminded me of an Oxbridge College in its configuration. And we went up this wooden staircase, and the smell was a smell I experienced today downstairs in the library. The smell was the smell of musty books. Can there be anything more glorious for a scholar than the smell of musty books? And the other great smell was old furniture, by which I mean pre-IKEA furniture, before the world was destroyed by that terrible assemblage of their kits. It smelled of leather, of old polish, and it was glorious. We went into Stella's rooms. Peter Muller, in the typical tradition of an Austrian gentleman, went over, took her hand, said, Küss die Hand, Frau Baronin. And as he was saying, Küss die Hand, Frau Baronin, I saw Stella looking over his shoulder at me, as it were, taking a first glimpse of the cut of my jib. She wanted to see what I was like, and years later, of course, I thought, well, she was well used to doing that when she was a major operative for MI6 before the war, and I said she would be very used to testing the quality of a man by a first view. She immediately put me at my ease. She knew I was nervous. She knew I wanted to talk about Auden. And the minute we started talking about Auden, it became literally a friendship from that moment. Years later, it became an extraordinary friendship because she once wrote me the most beautiful letter I'd ever received in my life, because it contained the following phrase. She ended the letter by saying, my dear Michael, you must feel free to tell me whatsoever you wish at any point of our relationship, but I shall ask no questions. Now, where could you find something as beautiful as that? A young man unsure of himself, unsure of the world, with this great woman telling you that she will be there for you. I remember going to see her after I visited the Polish town of Lublin, outside of which is one of the most terrible concentration camps, Majdanek. And I went there with a scholar from the University of Lublin, and he said, I won't go in, I've been in, it's terrible, I can't go in. So I went in and I was alone in front of the terrible vision of these ovens, which I had only ever seen, of course, on television. And I immediately started crying, and I fell to my knees and started to pray. And I was so unsure of my emotions that when I went back to Stella the next day, I asked her, I said, "Are those emotions real?" And she said, "Those emotions are as real as any emotions you will ever experience in your life, and probably more real." And she said, "I come from an ancient family. We go back to the year 800, to Rory, King of Wales. But," she said, "there isn't a drop of Jewish blood in my family, and I so wish that there was." And she was philo-Semitic. She issued passports to Jews during the war, when she was in the passport office. She had so many of the Jewish intellectual friends of her era under her wing and took very great care of them. And it was yet another aspect of this extraordinary woman. I really want to finish now by handing over to Marco. But before I do, I should say Auden had a particular way of saying goodbye. He didn't really like saying goodbye. Usually at dinner, he would get up from the table as he was finishing a sentence. It didn't matter who was there, if it was Stravinsky, if it was Sir Stephen Spender, his great friend and the poet laureate, no matter who, he'd just get up from the table at 9 o'clock, look at his watch and say, finish the sentence as he went. But occasionally he used this marvelous line from one of Rilke's elegies, I think it's the 9th, the Duino elegies. So leben wir und nehmen immer Abschied. And thus we live, forever saying farewell. And for me, it is not goodbye to Vienna. I intend to be back to talk about Auden again, but for now, it's farewell. Thank you very much. Thank you.